Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 601st New Social Environment. I'm Raven, the Special Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Sheida Soleimani, Anne Doran, and Matthew Biro. We're thrilled to welcome poet Joe Elliot here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded lands and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions. The Brooklyn Rail would like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive. You can view today's event and our full archive on the Rail's YouTube channel. And now to introduce today's guests and hosts. Artist Sheida Soleimani's work explores intersections of art and activism, melding sculpture, performance, film, and photography to highlight critical perspectives on events across the Middle East. Through constructing stage sets in her studio and documenting them with the camera, Soleimani focuses on the dissemination of information, adapting images from press and social media leaks to exist within alternative scenarios. Professor of History of Photography at Rutgers, the State University in New Jersey, Andrés Mario Zervigón is the author of John Heartfield and the Agitated Image and Photography in Germany. Zervigón leads the Developing Room, an academic working group at Rutgers devoted to photography studies. Rail Editor-At-Large Matthew Biro is the professor in the Department of History of Art at the University of Michigan. He is the author of Anselm Kiefer and Philosophy of Martin Heidegger, and many others. His reviews of contemporary art, film, and photography have appeared in Artforum, Art in America, Contemporary, Art Papers, and the New Art Examiner. Born and raised in Canada, Anne Doran lives and works in New York. Her work has been included in many exhibitions, such include MoMA PS1, The Kitchen, and many others. She has a solo exhibition on view at March until July 29th, 2022. And with my pleasure, I'm gonna pass it over to Anne.
Hi, everybody. We're here today to talk about Los Angeles photographer, artist, and educator, Robert Heinecken, who died in 2006, and whose 40-year career in art spanned the 50s through the 90s. Though he happened to be the founding director of UCLA's photography program, where he taught over 30 years. His own work was primarily using cameraless techniques and appropriated images. His interest in how personal and collective identity is formed by public imagery makes him an important forerunner of what's known as the pictures generation of artists and younger artists like Sheida. And his methods have made him an important link between Dada, Surrealism, pop, and postmodern photography. In spite of this, Heinecken's been underknown as an artist for most of his career. Although not as a professor, I want to point out that I did promote this conversation and I heard from at least 5 people who had either studied with him, whose parents had studied with him, who taught with him, or had been an adjunct in his classes. It was quite amazing how many people knew of him as a professor until quite recently. So to talk about his work and his place in the history of 20th century art, we've got Matthew Biro, professor of modern and contemporary art at the University of Michigan, and the author of Robert Heinecken and the Art of Appropriation. It's the first book-length study dedicated to the artist. Matthew's going to be joined by the artist Sheida and art historian Andrés, who will add their insights. And I'm Anne Doran. I'm an artist and an editor for the visual arts. So Matthew, I'm starting with you. And as you've been warned, I'm just going to start with the question, why Robert Heinecken? Why a book by you? Why now? What you clearly believe in his importance to the history of 21st century art. And I love it if you gave an overview of the artist and where he fits.
Great. Okay. Thank you. So if I could have the first slide, that will be helpful. Great. Thank you so much. So my interest in Heineken emerged, just through kind of going to shows and seeing a number of shows, after he was dead. He died in 2006. He was born in 1931 in LA. That really kind of got me interested in him. I had just finished a book on Berlin Dada art, so a lot of the same strategies that I think are important in Heidegger, namely appropriation and montage, putting together different elements to make to create a new meaning. So I was struck, first of all, by kind of similarities between Heineken and what came before, the artists who influenced him, and then also the media critique of, what I was thinking of as postmodern photography, figures like Richard Prince, Barbara Kruger, Cindy Sherman, others now more known under the term the pictures generation, and maybe we can talk about some of the differences later on. But as you see on the left, Richard Prince, his cowboy images from 1980s, postmodern photographers would appropriate advertising imagery and present them in a fairly unmediated, unfiltered way. Here we see Prince taking these Marlboro cigarette ads with cowboys in them, decontextualizing them by cutting out any of the ad copy and presenting us, getting us to think about what? Well, American myths, the myth of the frontier, the active male protagonist, quote unquote, taming the frontier. At the same time as in the news, a lot of the actors who were in these ads were becoming public, talking about dying of lung cancer. So Prince, being a very savvy kind of figure, choosing these images of myth making at the same time that the myths were being punctuated by reality. Or on the right, Barbara Kruger, when I hear the word culture, I take out my checkbook with a howdy doody figure. Using, again, lampooning the art market, our attraction to culture, our desire to put a price tag on culture. What they were doing and what Heineken was doing is roughly the same things. They were appropriating images. They were not photographing their own images. They were rephotographing, creating a critique of originality. One argument you can make is there's so many images in the world, why make a new one? All we can do is recycle the old one. So it was a critique of the nature of art. It was a critique of the nature of subjectivity. We are no longer original. We're just kind of parroting the past. And it was getting us to think about how the media had affected our lives. Next slide, please. Boom. Okay, so this is what Heineken was doing roughly 1966. So if, roughly 15 to 20 years before. And he was making these appropriations of, in this case, a New York Times newspaper page, and doing various things to it. First, I want to show you how they were made, and then we'll talk about the issues. So this would be one of his gelatin silver prints that he produced, and it's a photogram. So next slide, please. So what is a photogram? A photogram is a cameraless photograph. So it really goes back to the origins of photography before William Henry Fox Talbot could even make images in the camera obscura or a regular camera. He would work with things like lace, flowers, leaves, things like that to make cameraless images. So you put the thing that you hopefully a very thin thing in this case, on photosensitive paper. You expose it to light, you get rid of the thing, you develop it, and this is what you get. This catches on. I'm giving you an example from Anna Atkins, who makes a series of incredible books of algae in the 1850s. And as one of you just mentioned, also Man Ray, you can also think of Moholy-Nagy. So it's the first form of photograph that exists even before photographs in the camera. It gets renewed for making kind of abstract allegorical photographs in the 1920s by figures like Christian Schad, Man Ray, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, and others. Next slide, please. So Heinichen is taking this very old type of photographic process, and he's applying it to, in this case, a New York Times Magazine page. So this is the front and back of the page he's using. Next slide, please. Now you see the front of the page with how the photogram compared with the photogram. And next slide, please. And now you see the back of the page with the photogram again. So he's taking this very outmoded form of photographic practice and using it to do some perfect, let's just leave it there for a second, to create these images that are getting you to focus on the mass media. So what he's doing between 1966 and 1968, which I think is an incredibly fascinating moment of US history, is he's making something like 2,000 of these things and then slowly kind of redacting them down. And like a lot of artists, he creates extensive files of, you know, different types of images. He's looking at them, often holding them up to the light so he can begin to gauge what the image will look like. Then he's contact printing selected ones, and then move to the next slide, please. And we'll hold on these. He does that for a series of about 4 or 5 years, and then he makes a portfolio called Are You Ray or Are You Ria, depending on who you talk to, which he collates 25 of these, and he takes the contact print, he takes the gelatin silver photograms that he's made, he creates printing plates, and then he prints them in an edition of 500. And I'm showing you the first and the last plate from Are You Ray? So what is interesting about this to me? Well, Heinichen is, you know, doing a selection of kind of basically news imagery in texts, as well as, you know, which includes advertising, because very importantly for Heinichen, you do not get news, you do not get magazines, you do not get television without advertising. These are basically media for advertising, so they're, you know, firmly entrenched within a capitalist economy, and they are designed to incite consumption and sell us something, incite, you know, us to buy something. So the first page, you see kind of like a magazine cover almost of a woman removing her shirt. It's hard to tell, but she's made up of different pieces of furniture, screening stuff that kind of come through that you can vaguely see in her body. On the last page is a much more complex image. You see two men in the dark, kind of in silhouette, flailing, a cop facing them, seemingly a gun behind his back, and a sign saying the cop is our friend, ha 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 ha. So when Heinichen created this portfolio, he went from images that suggested female fashion magazines, fashion makeup, self-presentation, through kind of more news imagery, we would say here. So he's getting us to think about how advertising and the news are all mixed up. He's getting us to think about how who we are, in very literal way, composed of other objects, as you see on the left, the chairs, the screens, etc., within this figure. And he's getting us to question, really like the postmodern photographers, question what is the mass media doing? How is it addressing us? What is it doing to our consciousness? Now, what interested me in, we all contained multitudes, as G.E. Schwartz notes. What interested me in these images, beyond the media critique, was the fact that they become very ambiguous. All the figures, for example, in these two images are white. I know that because I looked at the original magazine pages in the archives, and you can kind of tell it that way, but they become very racially ambiguous, particularly the final image kind of on the left, the two figures. It would be very easy for us from our current perspective to kind of put this into a Black Lives Matter perspective and see it as anti-Black violence, which is certainly, going on at the time, and certainly a meaning that Heineken would encourage. But beyond the media critique, what I was very attracted to in Heineken's work was the ambiguity that he produces in his figures. Was the kind of the crossing of race, the crossing of gender, the crossing of animate and inanimate, human and machine. That's something I looked at in Dada art, and I found it very kind of powerfully embodied in Heineken's work. Another thing that I really liked and I thought was more pointed in Heineken's work than in the work of the postmodern photographers was he was a real historian of photography. So he's constantly using different submedia, different kind of photographic techniques, like the photogram technique, like using Polaroid instant film, different things like that, to estrange his images, to make his images, but also to make them strange, and getting us to think about what's going on historically. So I thought that was very important. The Heineken getting us to think about not just what's going on, who is being represented, what is it trying to depict, what are the possible effects on different viewers who would see these images. So he's getting us to think about all of that, but he's also trying to get us to think about the development of the media and how that has radically changed things. So he became a very interesting person to think about the changes in the mass media that have occurred over time. That's my first answer to your question. So that's why Heineken. I found him an important figure, and I found him doing things that maybe the postmodern photographers were not doing. Also found him working in a different context, in a different time period, which brings up different issues simply because, the mid to late 60s is a very different time than the 1980s. So I think that's important. Why is Heineken not known as well? That's also a fascinating question that has to do with media. And I got to remind myself, if I have to stay close to my mic, not to move around too much. Why is Heineken not well known? Well, he was a photographer. And until the 1980s, really until the rise of postmodern photography, the art worlds and the photography worlds were really radically different. So you could be a very well-known photographer, as Heineken was. He was on the cover of After Image numerous times. He was the founder and best known exponent of a very important graduate program in photography. He wrote extensively, he taught extensively, but he was really not part of the art world. So even though his influences were artists, he saw photography as an art. His work was really, he was shown in photography galleries primarily, Light Gallery, others, Pace, but Pace Photography. And he really wasn't part of that world. So I think that's also why Heineken is not well known. There was periodic attempts to get him to show him further. This is other work which we're not going to kind of talk about. It's again the same photogram technique, but now multiply printed. What I wanted to just show with this is how the body is transformed. But I guess this will be my last point before I stop. Are You Ray was really kind of a mixture of different points of view. It starts out with images that really seem to address a female audience in the sense of, fashion, photography, things like that, moves into a more general news audience. So he also made me very aware of the different modes of address in the media, and they're not all like a male gaze. And that kind of mixture of different gazes was also something that I found quite interesting. Here, this is a softcore men's magazine, kind of cheesecake imagery. But again, you see what he's done to it makes the body so unrecognizable. It's not kind of an erotic thing anymore. So yeah. That's my first answer. Okay. I don't know, the images keep going. Do you want this? I'd like to come back to at some point, but maybe let's get away from the slides for a second and see if there's another question.
Anne, you're muted.
Sorry, trying to keep the fan down. My next question is why not Heineken? He came under a lot of fire, especially after 1980, for using, not all his pornographic images were soft horror. And he came under a lot of fire for using that kind of imagery in his work. And although he used it literally in a number of different ways, I mean, his joining of pornographic images with advertising images really reflected to me the increasing use of the increasing conflation in advertising between material desire and sexual desire. The Chanel ads, the Vogue, the Vogue spreads, whatever. So he's literally reflecting something in the culture. He was also, in his own words, reflecting his predilections for porn. But I wanted to ask you also, and I think, there was a lot of pushback on his art in the 1980s from the likes of Martha Rosler, other feminist artists, although I would argue that Martha's work wasn't all that different from his in a lot of ways. But I was interested in the use of porn as metaphor, in fact, and I was wondering if you would maybe talk a little bit about that, if my question makes sense.
Porn as metaphor for desire or metaphor for what's going on in the United States, this kind of change that's happening?
Porn as a metaphor for perhaps unequal power. Porn is a metaphor for desire. Porn as, a metaphor for, maybe not even a metaphor, but an actual visual representation of the kind of advertising techniques that were increasingly, the marketing of the conflation of consumerism aimed at women and sexual imagery. There was a lot of it, but I meant, if you're making work about people and cultures and society, where are you going to get pictures of bodies?
I mean, I think that, sorry.
I'm sorry, and as a metaphor for maybe unequal, as a criticism, or a metaphor for power, for desire, for personal, maybe even just for creativity. I don't know. I believe that pictures of bodies can be used in a lot of different metaphorical ways.
I mean, I think I agree with all of that. I think, porn is kind of becomes a metaphor for all of that. I think Heinichen, and I didn't pick a lot of pornographic images. He never uses what we would call real hardcore pornography in the sense of kind of showing penetration and stuff like that.
Unlike Wallace Berman.
What's that?
Unlike Wallace
Berman, Jeff Koons, Marilyn Minter, Betty Tompkins. I mean, there are a lot harder artists. Let's just put it that way. But he was early on, and I think it's an important part of his work. I think what it pointed me to was really and I think this is kind of a more general topic that we might get into, is the role that pornography plays in our society. And I think that is very central. If you look at, histories of pornography or analyses of pornography, you see, first of all, that it is completely tied to the development of the mass media. And what I mean by that is the earlier practitioners of photography, of cable television, of film and video, were making money. They were through porn. So it was an immediate type of imagery that nobody talked about, and yet burgeoned very, very quickly. So you think around, the development of photography, you have artist model pictures that, were not simply sold to artists, these carte de visites, these cabinet cards later on, but that were, that found a lay audience that wanted this material. When you think, for example, about the development of cable television in the 70s and 80s, which completely transformed network broadcasting, cable starts in hotels. That's where you got cable television initially, and there was always a selection of pornography. When you think about the internet, what was the cause for, faster modems, better graphics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is again the incredible consumption of pornography that the internet released. So I think Heinichen was seeing it as, yes, a metaphor in our society for what was going on, but much more, it was a type of imagery that was growing, perhaps, proliferating to a degree far more than any of our, kind of quote unquote, non-pornographic imagery. It was something that society didn't talk about, and yet it seemed to have very profound effects. And when I analyze pornography, one of the things that it seems to me that characterizes it, it's a type of image that you don't really see as constructed initially. People who look at porn, you react very viscerally, almost like it's a human being. Not everybody, obviously, but that's kind of the reaction. It's not, you're not looking at it as art or how they did the lighting or something like that, or what the metaphor is, but it becomes a substitute for a human being. The only other type of imagery that I think has this effect is images of violence. And I think they go hand in hand together. The incredible proliferation of pornography and the incredible proliferation of imagery of, violence, people dying, people being mutilated, hurt in one way or another. And I think that has an effect on us. And I think Heinecken thought it has an effect on us. So he was using that in a certain way to get to this broader idea of how are things changing. The porn work comes up very strongly in the 70s because that's a moment of incredible change in the nature of pornography. Pornography starts, photographically. When it moves to film, it's basically these short stag films. They're shown in brothels to a collected male audience. So it's kind of homosocial, and, about sex. In the 70s, there are a series of court cases really, or around literature that have an effect on pornography, that loosen it very much. So suddenly there are places in bookstores and cities where more and more porn is being sold, where you begin to get the stag films again, these short loops that people can see. If you guys are fans of the HBO series The Deuce, it's about that moment. Suddenly in the 70s, pornography becomes, they start making feature-length films like Deep Throat and other movies, which are supposedly also supposed to invite female audiences in. So it doesn't become exclusively male anymore. So I think he was kind of reflecting that. And so that becomes kind of very important for me, these changes in these viewing habits. And, conceptually, I think the things are really, what kind of an effect does it have? What kind of effects do censorship of porn has? Because remember, pornography was illegal until the 70s and basically outlawed through something called the Comstock Act from 1873. And that act prohibited all sorts of immoral materials like texts, pornographic texts, pornographic images, but also birth control and anything that could be used to have an abortion. So together, so you see censorship has these other forms of control in it. So I'm very interested in that. I think Heinecken was as well.
You've talked a little bit. Well, I don't know. Would you care to comment on the fact that there is a certain segment of the population that believes even if you are using porn critically, which it's still, Heinecken was pretty defined about his use of porn. Actually, he was oblique and, and would say he, was just reflecting a certain kind of masculinity in American culture during those years. But there is a large section of feminist thought that believes even if you're using it critically, you're still consuming it and therefore contributing to the abuse of women. Have you got a comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's a super important issue. I think, photography is objectifying, as is film and video. If we're watching,
in many ways, I would say, yeah.
Yeah, in many ways, and in kind of a fundamental, so film, video, photography often use people in all sorts of different states to create an image, to appeal to a spectator, to give that spectator information, entertainment, knowledge. So there's that exploitative problem, and I think almost all of the mass media. Pornography and images of violence are the extreme, and I would say they're not, again, not that much different. We become concerned with pornography for is it exploiting the actors? We become concerned with pornography. Is it changing consciousness, making us desensitized, making us view everybody in the same way that we view a pornographic image? So that problem is there, but I think Heineken's point would be you have to kind of deal with it. So, you know,
I personally was just as shocked by that first spread and of like some kind of fashion show with a burned out building and kids in rags. I just sort of, what was that? I mean, I found that image pretty much as shocking as any softcore images that he was using, speaking of exploitation.
The first image I started
Yeah.
with, are you asking about? It was from the New York Times Magazine from, I think, 1965. I'm not quite sure exactly what it was. But, you know, I mean, porn brings up these incredibly uncomfortable questions. But, you know, should an artist use or not use porn? I think, you know, art is about asking questions like, how would a radical feminist feel about somebody studying pornography? Clearly, you know, I think that might be important just because, you know, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. It has a big effect on our society. I mean, I'm old. I'm 60, so I can kind of see the way people dress, the way people act, the way people self-objectify themselves today in social media is significantly different than, you know, even the 1970s and 1980s when I grew up. So I would say this is a kind of form of imagery, pornography, but also images of violence that we have to heed and we have to really take seriously. And I think that means examining it. It doesn't mean that every use of it is a good use, but I think saying we can't talk about it or artists can't make art, which kind of probably will use that imagery fairly ambiguously to raise questions, to create dialogue. I think that has a very important place in our society.
I do believe that is an issue with a lot of art, is that something isn't, you know, the text doesn't run underneath saying this is bad. You know, it's artists tend to reflect their times without a lot of commentary, shall we say. So we're at 1:40. I had a few questions that I would like to pull Sheida and Andres into. Specifically, Sheida, would you like to talk about your art a little bit? Because we're talking about, I think it's a good segue. We're talking about the use of violent imagery in art. And I was thinking, I wanted to actually ask Matthew about this, about the role of trauma, collective and individual, in his art, if he sees, and I see that, but I don't know if you do. But obviously, Sheida, your work centers a lot around trauma. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and also what links you find in your own work to Heineken's work.
I'm muted, but I think I'm unmuted. Okay, absolutely. Thanks.
Okay.
So yeah, I guess we'll start with the slides and I'll do the same thing and I'll cue you as to
I mean, I find this a horrifying image.
It is, and absolutely just, and this is one of the more tame ones that I chose. And so I should have probably given a trigger warning. But there is a live leak video that was released in 2009 during the Green Movement in Iran, which was after a rigged election where Mahmoud Ahmadinejad came into power. And there were students protesting on the streets. This woman is Neda Agha Sultan. She was with her father and with her professor, and she was protesting peacefully, you know, just carrying a sign and walking down the street, and was shot by the Basij, which is a paramilitary. And in this 1 minute and 52-second video, you see her fall to the ground and slowly die. And in American media, you know, I grew up in the States, but my parents are political refugees from Iran. And it was very rare that I would see anything in the news about Iran unless it had to do with uranium enrichment or gasoline at all, you know. So when the Green Revolution happened, I was astounded and was really interested in like how this video was being shown, was being pixelated. So in a sense, it was being censored. Obviously, it's pornographic in the sense that it's extremely violent, in the same way that when we are watching images of Black bodies getting shot by police, you have the ability to watch that on your phone and rewind it and watch it over and over and over. And so that's reenacting that violence. And people are, you know, so obsessed with watching the event or watching this individual die that they're forgetting about the actual cause of what's, you know, happening at all in the first place to make this event possible. And so that was really like a kind of initial interest for me. And that's what brought me to Heineken as well. And thankfully, Matt and I met when I was in grad school at Cranbrook, and we just had a lot to talk about. But I'm interested in the fact that he thinks about appropriation being a strategy that he could construct or use to construct a cultural critique. And for me, that's the same thing, right? Like growing up in the States, seeing the, you know, ability or the access points for people to understand what's happening in the greater Swana region versus what's happening at home, and, you know, being able to differentiate between what's good or bad has always been fascinating to me. And in the same way that Heineken is thinking about phrenology, physiognomy, he's blurring in those newscasters, he's blurring their faces all together and thinking about, you know, how are we distinguishing one from the other? I've always been thinking about how we are societally conditioned to believe these constructs that have been, you know, taught to us by the people around us. And that was huge for me also growing up as a Iranian person in Ohio. So I think that that slide, I started really thinking a lot about what it means to use these images. I'm thinking, again, just like Heineken's thinking about advertising, I'm thinking less about using the advertisements, but I'm thinking about photographing my pieces like they are ads. So I'm using the mechanics of, you know, still life photography as you would use in like a photo studio for Vogue or Amazon, the same way that you would shoot a $5,000 purse on a photo sweep with like 2 soft boxes and, you know, like advertisement lighting. And so in that sense, I'm really thinking about humor, but also this Trojan horse and how, you know, Americans, especially now, don't really want to contend with difficult content. I spoke with someone a few weeks ago that I asked them if they had heard about what was happening in Ukraine. This is a while ago at this point now, probably like a month or so. And they were like, oh, I'm trying to keep a positive bubble. And so that's astounding to me, right? Even I teach, so I see my students and they're, you know, oh, that image is too violent, I don't want to look at it, which I understand. But then there's this, you know, what are you going to look at instead? Or how are you going to learn about your information, or where is your information coming from? And so in that sense, I started thinking about my pieces kind of being this way of transmitting this information that might be difficult for people to find on their own, or too difficult for people to look at their own. So in this image titled Nega, after Neda Agha Sultan, you see images of her face throughout the 1 minute and 52-second video that are clipped and strewn about. Sugar cubes are a kind of recurrent theme in my work, referencing sacrifice because they're used for sacrificing lambs. And the oil kind of is like the mortar of the bricks of the country. Yeah. You're muted. Oh, and you're still muted.
I'm trying. Okay, I'm also but keep going with your your
I'll do it.
speaking, but I'm also interested because of the last slide. I also, Heineken did a lot of photo sculpture.
Yes.
And I see that being, I'm thinking about Sarah Swinner, I'm thinking about you, I'm thinking about Yamini Nayar.
Yeah, I love Yamini.
Yeah, he didn't actually do much setup photography, but I'm interested in this continuation of the idea of joining photography with sculpture, which I think you're a big part of quite a lot of women who are practicing this, which is interesting to me.
Yeah, and that was really interesting for me in this series. So in To Oblivion, this is kind of an article. So I'm kind of giving source images of each of the photographs that come after them. So Sakine Mohammadi Ashtiani was executed. If you go to the next slide, actually, you'll see the photograph that I made. And so I was thinking a lot about what does it mean to reanimate bodies, especially bodies that have been disappeared by the Iranian regime and government, and what does it mean for their images to be like reprinted and reanimated, or actually sculpturally stuffed and physically made into these kind of likenesses of Bender as Bobo dolls. And so in this sense, I'm also thinking about the photograph being aggressive. It's a really fucked up medium, in so many ways. And so when you photograph someone, it can be extremely violent. And so what does it mean for this photographic trace to be left of these women? What does it mean for me to print it, reanimate it, stuff it, but then just to photograph it and flatten it again? So I'm also thinking about the act of photography, like reasserting the violence that's happening already in these situations. And you can just keep going through the slides. And I'm also thinking about sexuality a lot too, obviously, in pornography and pain, and thinking also about like trauma and war and porn here. So in my series, Medium of Exchange, I started looking a little bit more at OPEC ministers and Western politicians that were trying to gain control or access to oil. So the UN chief Ban Ki-moon was blacklisted Saudi Arabia because of their human rights violations in Yemen. And Saudi Arabia, blackmailed them and said that they would cut off humanitarian aid and all of their gas and oil and funding. So I'm also thinking about like sexual warfare and play. So, Khalid al-Fali of Saudi is a dom, while Ban Ki-moon is the sub. And then the last few images are from two of my more recent series. And so Heineken also is using a lot of, TV, video, media images and sourcing those to create, larger photographic pieces or layering them. And I started thinking actually in January of 2020, right before the pandemic, but when Qasem Soleimani, who is not related to me, was assassinated, started thinking about, again, phrenology, physiognomy, how do we think someone is good? How do we think they're bad? How do we view them? And what happens when you disembody them? And so also even thinking about Dada collage and the idea about like the cyborg and cutting the body and resituating it and putting it back together, I started kind of dismembering these politicians from their hands. And then again, thinking about body language and gesture, what does it mean to point? And how do we think someone is good or bad? And so in this image, we have the hand of Hassan Rouhani with a dove, which we think is a peaceful animal, and a white flag. But in the background, there's the images of the jet PS-752 being shot down by an Iranian missile. So in a sense, you might get the idea that this person is good, or this actor or politician is good, but that's only because you're seeing the symbols around it and they're not. And then the last image, I'm thinking a lot also about like pop culture and popular media and tabloids. And so the New York Post had this article that was like, was Qasem Soleimani really assassinated? Can we tell? Because the ring on this dismembered hand doesn't look exactly the same that the ring that he's wearing in life. And so this last image that I made is his hand in life reflecting an image of his hand in death, while you see the images of his missile strike that were caught from the live leak footage of the missile strike that happened in the background. So yeah, I'm thinking a lot about playing around with these images, manipulating them, layering them. What does it mean to rephotograph them? And then also I like humor, so I add tongue-in-cheek kind of props. So in this, for example, you have raw agate in the bottom because the ring is made out of agate. And that's a kind of divine stone in Islamic culture.
You mentioned Dada. So I think it's time to talk to Andres.
Yes, let's
whose
go.
expertise this is. And I had a few questions here too. Because Matthew had brought up, I don't know if you have time, Andres, but Matthew had actually brought up the idea of the uncanny in Heineken's work. And also Sheida just brought it up in her own work. Talk to us about, and your knowledge is broad and we don't have much time, but would you care to take us through Dada to, you mentioned the contemporary uses of montage, especially by right-wing actors. So could you place Heineken a bit in as a bridge?
Sure. So I'll do this kind of quickly, and what I'll emphasize is that now Matt knows this really well because Matt wrote a book on Dada, and a really great. He edited a special issue on photo montage before the avant-garde. He wrote on Gursky. So this is something like Matt you also have embedded in your head. But one of the things that you note in your book is that there's Dada, which is rupture, it refuses meaning, it's quite jumbled in its practice of montage. And then someone like John Heartfield, he was German, that was a pseudonym, simplifies the procedure, makes it more laconic so as to deliver a message more clearly than Dada photomontage did, because Dada was largely about scrambling meaning. But here's an example of what was happening with Heartfield, taking, like Heineken, images out of mass media and then trying to turn their meaning. The idea being that he could expose the truth lying behind the surface of appearances to which the camera is otherwise dedicated. So this is a seriously political form of photomontage. And what I like that you're doing, Matt, is that you're showing how Heineken draws from this. He is a photo historian as well as a photo teacher and photo artist or photographist.
You mentioned he was a giant pedagogue.
But that's the other thing. So
yeah.
Yes, and so I would emphasize this too, that this is something that we have to consider in maybe why he's less known. And I say this because there are a lot of people who are also photo pedagogues. Photo departments were being opened in the 1960s and 70s around the United States. And so they were being populated by photographers who then were teaching the practice, the medium. And they, as in part historians, were reprising old processes at a time when, as you point out in the introduction of your book, Matt, documentary photography was really the mode. So I think partly what's happening is that they're reprising old processes just as photography is hitting the art market as a documentary art practice. And so I feel like it's forever that they're being ignored because they're not on the bandwagon when it comes to photographic practices that are in the galleries. So those are pretty significant, not as significant as painting, and they kind of missed the boat. And if you advance a few slides, I'll just emphasize quickly that there are examples of this. Keep going. And they are also pedagogues. Keep going. And they too, keep going, get ignored. So like Jerry Ulsman, no, go back. Jerry Ulsman and Betty Hahn are also photo pedagogues. Ulsman in Florida, Betty Hahn I think is working in Indiana. And they suffer largely the same process of not being discussed in photo history and being seen as significant in the art scene as the documentary photographers. This is what Heineken suffered as a pedagogue. And then lastly, I want to emphasize Heineken is in touch with the political valence of photomontage. But photomontage, if you go back a slide, in the 90s, and early 80s increasingly became to be
Mood
less
boards.
political and more emotive person. They were like a mood board. This is what
Mood boards, yeah.
Charlie White, the photographer, says, yes, that it becomes a kind of equivalent to the inside of a teenager's locker, that it's no longer about political statement, it's about self-expression, as summed up by a now dead website called Polywar, where you could montage together outfits based on the products that agreed to advertise on the website.
Wow.
And this is an example of what was happening in the 90s and 2000s in the beginning. And you go a little 2 slides further, I believe. One of the things that concerns Charlie White is that photomontage need not be a left critical practice, because the right wing has picked up on it in memes. And I'm showing this really terrible one that I found on Reddit. And it's a right wing photo montage, more or less, that's making a political statement that's super sexist and using practices that we associate with critical approaches to photography. And if people complain about Heineken using representations of female bodies, I think this is a measure of exactly how extreme you can get and what photomontage is actually now becoming online. I just wanted to underscore the larger field of the practice, of course, across time as well. But I'll stop there since we're getting to 2 minutes before the hour.
Thank you guys so much. I don't know if Matthew, you said you had to leave at 2 o'clock.
No, I'm here as long as you want me to be.
Oh, great. Okay.
Great.
I think we're entering Q&A time, correct, Raven?
Yes. So our first question is from GE, and you should be able to unmute.
Hi, thank you so much, Raven. Thinking overall of appropriation and of course tipped off by and thinking of Heineken's appropriation, but then more appropriation in general. Do we think that our connectivity only heightens the artist's moral obligation for a kind of cultural sensitivity and to acknowledge that art is really obviously never made in a vacuum, but exists in particular geographies and histories and all the social contexts?
Who are you asking about this?
Anybody that wants to answer.
Anybody.
I'd love answers from anybody that really feels they want to reflect on it. Thank you.
I personally believe that almost all forms of art these days in some way or another, even if it's just expressionist figurative painting, is being informed by our connectivity in good ways and bad ways. I mean, you know, I really believe that, but it's in there in everything. I don't think any artist works in a vacuum, and that we're all being inundated with images, and that we're all trying to parse our connectivity and the, you know, the ocean of images that we live in, no matter how, you know, what, you know, how stuck in a studio making figurative paintings an artist may be, it's still in there, unless they're even in outsider art. I would say sometimes outsider arts are even more connected to our culture. So that's just my view, but anybody else is willing to chime in?
I mean, I totally agree that I think one has to be sensitive to this. In some ways, the genie is out of the bottle, though, in that our entire culture can copy and augment and transform images, sounds, etc. So the tools are in everybody's hands to steal, to objectify, to lie about things, create false news, et cetera, et cetera. And so it becomes more and more of something that has to become part of the discourse. What concerns me is sometimes artists are censured for doing things that are, really commonplace all over the internet. And I think artists are often doing it critically. So, I'd rather, go after the bad right-wing actors than complain about somebody's appropriation. But, again, one of the reasons that I was so interested in Heinicken is appropriation has become one of the dominant modes of art making. And it can be done in all these different ways from all these different perspectives. So, of course, the moral and ethical issues have to be considered. But just remember, the law tells you, fair use has these 4 criteria. Is it being sold? Well, the context, how much of the image are you using, et cetera, et cetera. So the law gives you far more leeway than we might as critics or artists or other producers when we see how an artist takes an image and manipulates it. Another thing that you didn't mention that I think is implied in what you're saying, who is speaking becomes very important. If a female artist is using an image that objectifies women, is that different than if a male artist does that? These are all questions that I think have become part of the discourse now.
Thank you,
Absolutely
Gigi,
agree.
for your
Thank you.
question.
Thank you, Raven.
Okay. We're now gonna have a question from Duncan, and you should now be able to unmute.
Oh, thanks. This is for Sheida. Sheida, did I say your name properly? Is it Sheida?
Yeah, you are. Thank you.
Oh, good. Yeah, I really appreciate what you're doing and the focus. I'm a very political person, but I wonder, there's a lot of, I don't know if you are, but there's a lot of, I'd say, what?
I'd say so, yes.
Yeah, I'd say, good. Okay, well then I think you'll understand my question. I'm not reading it right now, but I'm just gonna say it. You must get some feedback about talking about Iran or your parents or any number of things. I'm wondering, is it a, because it's the personal approach, or it's, and you're willing to show that, and a lot of artists are not. However, you do disguise it very nicely, I think. So, I'm just speaking for you, but I don't mean to. I guess what I'm wondering is, what's the response from people about your perspective, not just to your art, but, to who you are?
It varies widely, and it's varied widely also depending on where I am. When I was in Ohio growing up, it was obviously extremely different. I was the only not white kid in like the area after 9/11. There was a lot of crazy, response to the Middle Eastern community. I think then that's also what really politicized me, maybe the most. My parents and what happened to them has been like a catalyst for me, for sure, because they were both extremely politically active, and because of their political activity had to go into hiding, were in fear of execution, and had to flee and became refugees in America. And so, being here, realizing that there's not really a vocabulary for many Americans as to what a political refugee is, or to having been silenced for political activity or viewpoints, it really got me to start including it into my work. And so I get mixed responses, right? Especially being in like the art world, you have to, if you sell your work, then there's some people that don't want to look at difficult things. There's some people that are specifically interested in difficult things. And then I actually get a lot of interest and responses from Iranians, especially. So then there's like also the divided camp of Iranians, right? The ones that are extremely left-wing Marxists that are like, yes, thankfully someone's saying it. then the other half that have fled and have found a different type of life here, and they don't want to reflect on that. And so they're like, oh, well, why can't you say good things about Iran instead? And so it's a mixed bag for sure. I think my impetus and my desire to talk about it is because of the lack of knowledge here in the United States about what's happening, I mean, everywhere else really, but for me specifically in Iran. And the fact that the gaze is still so Orientalist. And so what does it mean to be able to talk about that through my work and to provide an alternative platform?
Yeah, I see that. I'm not an expert on art and imagery, but I see the Orientalist, not so much directly, but sort of indirectly, you know, if that makes any sense. You know, an Orientalist is not a good word, but what I mean is, there's a certain lacy and lovely quality to the work. And I just want to say thank you for that. And it must be hard sometimes talking from a very personal perspective. I mean, appropriating images is an intellectual conversation and very interesting, but inside of everything is all of these other meanings and feelings. So, you know, I just wanted to bring it up.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, and then we have Andres has a question for Matt. So
Yeah, just to add, I'm interested in perspective. And in fact, I kind of know the answer a little bit because I've read your text on this, but Sheida, you've talked about what you appreciate in Heineken and the way Matt has written about Heineken. So Matt, what do you appreciate about Sheida having worked so hard on Heineken? Like, what can you say about Sheida that is informed by your work on Heineken and Dada?
Well, I think I was drawn to Sheida's work very early on, precisely because it fit a lot of interests of mine having to do with appropriation and montage. I'm very interested in, you know, strategies, you know, like where you were talking about different types of photo montage practice, artists. Hang on one second. Sorry, another phone call was going on right next to me. Different photo montage practices. So the way the mass media uses photo montage, not to create a conflict of interpretations or multiple meanings that go in all these different directions, but, you know, use photo montage to basically communicate a clear message, whereas more artists perhaps use montage strategies to create problems, something that you can't interpret one way or another, but you have to think about the context, stuff like that. So I'm very interested in those kind of strategies. I think that's what brought me to Sheida, really turning from work on Dada to more contemporary uses of photo montage. But, you know, she was just somebody who stood out and did really interesting work. And, you know, just as a writer and as a critic, I get a lot of inspiration from really hanging out in artists' studios and, you know, looking at their trash, looking at, you know, what's scattered everywhere, not only obviously their work too, and more importantly, getting a sense of what they're thinking about it, and then trying to understand that in terms of, you know, a development. So, for example, if I were to understand photo montage as a development where, you know, Heartfield's at one end, it goes back further, but let's just say Heartfield, Heineken's at another moment, Sheida is, you know, in the contemporary moment. Certainly her way of using imagery that is sexual or that's violent, seems to be more comfortable with this, more accepting of it in a certain way. When Anne, you said, well, you know, there are certain feminists who would just say any use of pornography is wrong. I understand that, but I also see that as something of an older position in that.
I'm not personally advocating that position, but Yes.
Yeah, I'm not saying you are. But I think we are so immersed in this visual environment where the images of violence and the images of sexuality are so proliferated. Sheida is an example of a person who, of an artist who wants to engage with that and uses it very powerfully, I think also very responsibly. When you think about, porn and sexuality, I mean, not all porn images necessarily have a negative effect. When you think about non-traditional, non-heteronormative sexuality, that imagery can also be exploited, but the proliferation of that imagery has also allowed a lot more people to think, oh, gee, that looks kind of, that's attractive, or, that I'm responding to that in some way. And I think, this is why Republicans also kind of try to censor it so much, because non-normative forms of sexuality and their representation, I think, can also give people who might not be in big cities a sense that they are not alone. So it can actually be affirmative and something positive. So my interest in Sheida is somebody, a really interesting, important artist who was dealing with a lot of these issues of sexuality and violence and politics that I thought were really crucial today. And again, I really value all our conversations and our friendship over the years.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like, I want to mention it's been like huge, like having met you when I did, because there was like access to so many like new ideas. Like I know I knew about Dada, but not to the extent in which you're writing about it and thinking about fractured bodies and the cyborg. And there's so many things that have kind of come into our work from so many of our conversations. So for artists like me, it's also really such a pleasure having historians and thinkers that are outside of, the studio practice in our studios.
And our final question is from our very own Fong Bui. So he should be.
Thank you, Raymond. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Anne. Thank you so much, Sheida and Andrea. Yeah, I was just heard your mention about censorship. It been come up here and there quite often, actually. I can't help but once I had this lengthy conversation with my beloved friend, the late Jonas Makers, because when he showed Jack Smith, Flaming Creature, in one Saturday in the winter, can't exactly remember the month, but I think it's September. One Saturday, he showed Flaming Creature, he was put in jail, and then only to be released because everyone in New York City got themselves together to lobby for his release. And that's everyone, Andrew Sarris, Maya Shapiro, Susan Sontag, you name it. They came to his defense. So they allowed Jonas to leave after a day and a half or two. And what did Jonas do again? The following Saturday, he showed Jean Genet only film, Un Chant L'amour, as you remember. And that essentially brought him to Supreme Court. The only thing that I want to make comment, and then my question will follow soon, is that the Republican senator demanded that Jonas would make copies of Un Chant L'amour so they can study over the weekends. So that say everything, doesn't it? About censorship from, from the
my aside to Matthew was actually that I'm finding recently, or not even so recently, that certain factions of society's obsession with other people's sexuality is sort of takes on a kind of unhealthy, to me, it's sort of like, it's a little bit unhealthy, your obsession with grooming. Like, really?
let me
So what do you think they were doing over the weekend, Fong?
This is the thing. Well, we don't want to go deep into what they do because it bores me to think about it. But the point is that when the statement he made, I think he published in Film Culture magazine. Essentially, what he's trying to say is that defending works of art is about obscenity and pornography, and more correctly, about what police understand or whoever else who possess the form of authority, so to speak, understand them as obscenity and pornography. In other words, what Jonas is trying to imply was that art exists on a higher spiritual, aesthetic, and moral plane. And I think that that has to be, given the place in a way, because I think that there might be need for licensing guns and dogs and not for works of art according to certain people. But ultimately, why we defend it, because art is all for everybody, for all the people, and it must be open and must be available to anyone who want to see it. And that's why we do what we do. And all right, so let me shift my question specifically to you, all of you, particularly Matt. Is there such relationship, Heineken, because I know your work quite well, Matthew, way back with Dada, and I can't help but to find way to connect to painting, so to speak. In other words, let's take someone like Francis Picabia, because whose name often come up, particularly with people like David Saleh in that whole crowd who also went to, Cal Arts, the idea of transparency, because Heineken's use of transparency in black and white is to me very haunting. So I don't only see violent loudness and other form of critical apparatus that he's trying to evoke, but I also see fluidity in alchemy, and that's something seemed to reference painting too, as much as it is his own invention with photography. Is there such reference in your own finding, Matthew, that he was someone who observed painting, or particularly Picabia and people like that?
I don't have any mentions of Picabia in what I've looked at. His hero is Marcel Duchamp. That was one big point of reference. The photogram technique with two sides of a page appearing. He tells various stories about that. The one artist he mentions is seeing a Kurt Schwitters poster where the glue that Schwitters had used to adhere something to a collage allowed both sides of the page to come through. But I think Heineken was thinking about art more generally. He did do works on canvas, photo transfers on canvas, although they were maybe not his most successful works. But I think, when we talk about appropriation and painting, that brings us again, even though it happens earlier, you think of, Picabia using kitsch, you think of Warhol as a classic example of, literal appropriations of news imagery. But again, the debate in the 80s was really strong about all these appropriationist painters. And one of the reasons postmodern photography was championed, because it was somehow held distinct from figures like, Anselm Kiefer, Sally to an extent. I think when postmodern photography gets historicized into broader movements, particularly through Eklund's book, The Pictures Generation, then Sally and other figures kind of come back in. But I think painters are also very, since the 80s, very focused on questions of appropriation having to do with originality, what that says about the artist's subjectivity as a recycler of images, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, well, thank you. That's very terrific question, and got response so well, which I expected. Thank you so much. I learned a lot today. about Heineken and going to contemplate more on this. So thank you all for this amazing discussion. And please come back if you have some other idea, because our social environment is going to continue forever. And it's important for us to amplify the slowness of our discussion against so-called demigod usage of speed. So we are using technology in the right way. So I just enjoyed so much. So thank you. Back to you, Raven.
Okay, thank you, Fong. And thank you all of you guys for such a wonderful conversation. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet of the day, Joe Elliot, to the stage. Joe is the author of Idea for B-Movie, Homework, and Opposable Thumb, as well as numerous chapbooks. For many years, he made a living as a letterpress printer. He now teaches English at Edward R. Murrow High School and lives in Brooklyn with his wife, Anne Noonan, and their 3 sons.
Hi, everyone. All right, I'm going to read some new poems. In the 70s, they invented nostalgia for the 50s. In the 90s, they invented nostalgia for the 70s. And now they're making movies set in the 90s. I like seeing the clothes and haircuts and cars and hearing the music coming out of the radios. But each of these little pleasure trips irons out my actual experience, whatever it had been, replacing it with the created overlay. And I become the unsedimented muck at the wide, wide mouth of someone else's, someone I'll never meet, ever slow-moving affluence. This is called Highway Poem. And Sheida, maybe you'll recognize the names. Have you ever actually met someone from Woonsocket? Are there people that grow up in Woonsocket? What would it be like to grow up in Woonsocket? What would it be like to be someone from Woonsocket? What's life like in Woonsocket? What does a Woonsocket look like? Shall we find out? Let's find out. Oops, too late. That was the exit. Have you ever actually met someone from Attleboro? Are there people that grow up in Attleboro? What would it be like to grow up in Attleboro? What would it be like to be someone from Attleboro? What's life like in Attleboro? What does an Attleboro look like? Shall we find out? Let's find out. Whoops, too late. That was the exit. Have you ever actually met someone from Pawtucket? Are there people that grow up in Pawtucket? What would it be like to grow up in Pawtucket? What would it be like to be someone from Pawtucket? What's life like in Pawtucket? What does a Pawtucket look like? Shall we find out? Let's find out. Oops, too late. That was the exit. All right, this one is from, this is one of the poems that the Brooklyn Rail published in June. Thank you. From the point of view of the water cycle, all water is one. A snowflake is a drop of dew waiting to happen. The rivulet running along the Brooklyn curb started in the Antarctic. The steam gushing from my kettle might as well be a cloud drifting over Harlem and the northern half of Jersey and the lower Catskills. The steaming stream of piss hitting the base of the tree behind the bowl of which the wanderer has taken refuge from the eyes of everyone is the bottle of Perrier on the table at the cafe overlooking Broadway. Niagara Falls, with all its thunder, is nothing more than the bead of perspiration on the underlip of your lover. Yet I want to think that I am me, and my mind is mine, and my thoughts and feelings are unitary and unique, and that my life, thus separate, might matter. Got one more. What I am doing. When the universe cried, "I'm so lonely, isn't there anyone out there for me?" she was met with a dense silence that was entirely appropriate. For who would want to conjugate irregular verbs all afternoon with Sister Mary Teresa, stern in that sprightly way, though she may be? So when she added, who will be my lover? Everyone else, in order to preserve their particular identities, their identifiable particularities, where brushing one's teeth is brushing one's teeth and driving to work is driving to work, took one step back, leaving me all alone with her. And here I am 48 years later, and what I am doing is never what I'm doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. And thank you, Sheida, Andres, Anne, and Matthew. Over the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has brought together art, music, dance, film, theater, literature, and thoughtful social and political mediations in our monthly publication and in our public events, like here in our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support our writers, editors, and operations here at the Rail. Join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a radical poetry reading with Mia Yu, Chalar Kosa Egluit, Nisha Ramaya, and Lisa Robertson. You can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye as we leave.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Sheida.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you,
everybody.
Anne.
Thank you,
Sheida.
Thank you.
Thank you,
So much.
Andres. Thank you,
Thank you,
Joe.
Joe.
Thank you,
Awesome
Matthew.
group.
Thank
What
you
an
so
awesome
much.
group. What an awesome group.
Incredible conversation.
Beautiful reading.
Yes.
Beautiful reading.
Yes, I love the Rhode Island reference.
Yeah. Great poem.
I can tell you, you're not missing out on Attleboro.
Yeah. Who knows? It's such a mystery.
Not Jersey.
Yeah, congratulations also on the book, Matthew.
Yes.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, let's see
Alrighty.
how to promote.
Yay.
Duncan,
Yeah,
thank you for coming.
Yeah,
Thank you all.
Everyone take care.
Much love. Love and courage.
Love and
Talk-
courage.
Everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye, you guys. Thank you, Joe.
Good office.
Thank you.
Bye, Haji.
Bye.